Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I want to talk today a little bit about tax policy and families, and of course in the last few months the Prime Minister has indicated that the government will focus on developing a policy for a fairer go for families in 2015, and I welcome that focus because one of our core objectives should always be to support families and make it as easy as possible for people to have kids. I know, and I presume a lot of others would be in the same boat, but having children has been the best thing that's ever happened to me in my life, and the more we can remove barriers for people having children, I think the better. And I recognise that one of those barriers at the moment is, of course, the cost of childcare, and rightly there should be a strong focus on that. Childcare fees, as most would know in this chamber, have risen considerably in the last few years. In the Australian, there was a big write-up on that in the weekend, and apparently they've risen by around 50% since 2007. So it's a substantial increase and a large barrier for many families to having more children. But I do note that despite those costs, we do already spend $7 billion a year to help families access early childhood education or childcare in the preschool years of children's lives. And in a recent draft report, the Productivity Commission did make some recommendations to adjust and change that system. But even with their adjustments, which according to the PC would cost about an additional $1 billion a year, that would only encourage an additional 47,000 mothers or fathers to enter the workforce. Or in other words, it would cost us around $20,000 per extra person in a job. In my view, that's such a high cost would be wasteful if the objective was solely to encourage more women or men into the workforce. Of course, funding for childcare and early childhood education have broader objectives as well, and additional funding may be merited if particularly we want to focus on that early childhood education element. But I do actually today want to talk mainly about another form of childcare, a form of childcare that is often ignored, and that is the childcare that's provided by stay-at-home parents. Because while childcare costs, of course, as we know, are increasing, few recognise the undeniable fact that stay-at-home parenting is the most costly form of childcare. It is a burden when families today must pay 60% or even higher of their second incomes to put their child in childcare, and I recognise that. But then by definition, a single income family gives up 100% of their second income to stay at home to look after their child. And our tax system does not recognise these costs, or does not recognise them much in comparison to other countries, because unlike many other developed countries, our tax system provides little recognition of the high tax rates paid by single income families. Currently, half of all OECD countries treat spouses separately for tax purposes, treat spouses, I should say, separately for tax purposes, or have joint taxation or some joint elements that provide tax relief and tax credits that are transferable between partners. We don't in our system at all. In our tax system, single income families are the heavy tax lifters. They're the heavy lifters in our tax system because a disproportionate burden does fall on them. A single income household with 2 kids and an income of $120,000, so $120,000 from one income earner, pays tax of around tax of $34,700 currently. In contrast, a double income family earning $60,000 each partner or each parent earning $60,000 pays tax of $24,200 a year in our tax system. That's a difference of $10,500 per year, every year, between the single and double income family. These two families can have the same number of kids, they have the same household income, and essentially the same living cost pressures, yet the single income family contributes $10,000 more to fund government services every year. And the disparities carry right through all income levels. At $100,000, if a household had $100,000, a single income family pays $26,900 in tax, and the dual income family pays only $17,000. At $80,000 family income, the single income family pays $19,100 in tax, and these are all with 2 children, whereas a dual income family pays just $9,800 tax. That is unfair. That is unfair because it breaches a basic tenet of horizontal equity, which all tax systems should aspire to, and that basic principle is that people in similar circumstances should pay similar rates of tax. These two families that I've mentioned here have very similar circumstances but pay vastly different rates of tax, and in my view a fairer families policy needs to at least respond to this inequity. I have mentioned these figures before in the Senate, but I wanted to restate them because the government is developing this policy. I've mentioned some of those figures. And I want to mention something additional though today, because I think another consideration in the development of that policy is that things have gotten worse for single income families in the past few years rather than better. And when you think about those disparities in tax paid that I mentioned earlier, one of the key reasons for those disparities is the fact that a single income family has access to just one tax-free threshold, of course, whereas a double income family gets access to two tax-free thresholds by merit of two people working. And until a few years ago, Australia had a tax-free threshold of only $6,000, so the disparity in that regard wasn't all that great. But a few years ago, when the former Labor government introduced the carbon tax, they increased the tax-free threshold substantially. It went up from $6,000 to $18,200, and in July this year it'll rise again to $19,400. The new government has kept those thresholds that high, so that means that today, or by the end of this, by next financial year, a double income family will earn $38,400 a year, or can earn that much before they start paying tax, whereas a single income family will start paying tax after earning just $19,400. The changes, of course, widen the gap between double income and single income families. And you can actually quantify that, because if we instead applied the old tax scales we had before the carbon tax to people's income today, and I use that $120,000 family that I used initially before, if we applied those income taxes we had before 2012, the gap between the single income family and the dual income family would be $1,300 less. So by changing these thresholds and increasing them, a move this government supports and will continue, it has made the situation, the disparity between single income and dual income families, $1,300 a year worse off in the case of the $120,000 family. But of course that goes through all the income scales as I mentioned before, and it's about $1,000 difference. So $1,000 for most families difference by increasing the tax-free threshold. And I think we should deal with this disparity, not make it worse. And in particular on this side of the chamber, we're the party of choice. We want people to be able to make their own choices in life about how they want to have a go in life. We want to support people who want to have a go, who want to have a family, who want to start a business, who want to go out and develop new skills and go into a new industry. We should promote that. We should promote that choice, not discriminate against it. But at the moment, our tax system does discriminate against families that want to make the choice of stay-at-home parenting. And I do want to ask the question, what exactly is wrong with choosing to stay at home and look after your own children? It to me, is the most important job anyone can do, to look after their own children and have them develop. And I don't spend enough time with my children, I recognise that, but I'm lucky to have a wife who's happy to stay home and spend time with them. But I think regardless of what we do in our own lives, it's the most important thing we can do. Stay-at-home parenting doesn't necessarily reduce the amount of work done in the economy either, and that's often a basic error, because while if more childcare and more paid work will lift GDP, it doesn't necessarily change the amount of work done, because it can just be, particularly people just employ nannies, it just changes the mix of work and whether it's paid or unpaid. And a basic problem with economics is GDP does not measure all the things that go on in our economy, but sometimes in this place we focus on it far too much. There is also ample evidence that stay-at-home parenting improves child development outcomes, and the Productivity Commission mentioned those considerably in its paid parental leave report. And we spend billions of dollars on schools every year. Billions of dollars on some things that don't have a lot of evidence at all, particularly, say, IT at schools. But we don't seem to want to spend any money on something which has clear evidence, and that's that stay-at-home parenting does deliver benefits. But look, even with all of this discrimination that I've mentioned today, even with the tax system being so far against single-income families, there is still the fact that a third of families with children right now today rely on just one income, and more than 40% of families rely on one person for more than 90% of their income. So we can't have a fair families policy if we ignore a full 40% of families and the inequitable burden that is currently placed on them.
Thank you, Senator Canavan.